This is the ultimate space vehicle to ever touch down on the planet, Venus. It's truly the final one in an extensive series of efforts undertaken by the Soviet Union to investigate the most hazardous location in our solar system. This is what the Soviets discovered when they arrived on Venus, and why they never returned. The genuine enigma of Venus is how it can be so basically alike to Earth, and yet so disastrously dissimilar. While Mars usually receives all the focus nowadays in the 21st century, during the initial phases of the space competition, there was really much greater curiosity in examining Venus, and that's primarily because we can readily view the surface of Mars using powerful telescopes from Earth. So, we already possessed a fairly solid understanding that there wasn't much activity happening there. But Venus, conversely, has always succeeded in concealing its mysteries. All that we can observe from Earth is an unbreakable layer of dense clouds. Those clouds may block our sight, but they also reveal something crucial. It indicates that the planet must possess a thick atmosphere, far more comparable to Earth than Mars. And since Venus is even nearer to the Sun than Earth, it must be warm below, which at the period enchanted the minds of those on Earth. Our nearest kin could be a verdant, tropical jungle teeming with extraterrestrial bugs and lizards. Now, even in 1960, that was still merely a hypothesis, more believable than existence on Mars, but still not broadly accepted by the scientific group of the era. The renowned astronomer Carl Sagan had already spread the idea that the continuous cloud blanket of Venus was more probable to result from a greenhouse impact that had spiraled wildly and overheated the planet, meaning that the terrain beneath the clouds would be nothing more than a burned wasteland. But there was only one method to discover. As with all the early achievements in the space competition, the Soviet Union was the initial to attempt to examine Venus closely. The year was 1961, and the Soviets had already secured a commanding advantage over the United States by dispatching the first satellite into orbit with Sputnik. Then they sent the first human into space with Yuri Gagarin. They'd even been the first to dispatch a probe to the moon with Luna 2. And since Venus is the next nearest entity beyond the moon, sending a probe there, too, would have been an evident subsequent move. At the time, these early space operations weren't as much about the research and findings as they were about being the first to accomplish a historic feat. If we acquire some fascinating information about space in the process, that's wonderful. But propaganda and political advantages dominated in the Cold War period, with their goal fixed clearly on adding Venus to an expanding roster of successes. The Soviets constructed two probes, Venera 1 and Venera 2. This was a standard practice in the initial decades of space discovery to launch missions in duos, because there was still a very elevated chance that one of them was going to malfunction. You have to admire the boldness of these basic interplanetary voyages, with nothing more than a calculator to direct them. The Russian technicians attached a rocket motor to their probe, placed it atop a ballistic missile named the R-7, and plotted a path for Venus. Then they ignited it and wished for success. The positive aspect is that both probes managed to pass within 100,000 km of Venus. The negative aspect is that both probes suffered a complete system breakdown before arriving at their target, and thus no useful data was transmitted back. While the Soviets returned to the planning stage, NASA continued with their own Venus operation. In 1962, the Americans triumphed where the Soviets had stumbled. NASA's Mariner 2 probe passed within 35,000 kilometers of Venus and performed the first intimate inspection of another planet. During a 42-minute examination of Venus, Mariner 2 collected substantial data on the Venusian atmosphere. What they uncovered was alarming. The data verified Sagan's hypothesis about the greenhouse effect, with temperatures recorded up to 459 F or 237 C. which is twice the boiling point of water. And that's just what they could gauge from orbit. Mariner 2 also discovered that there was an extraordinarily high cloud layer that stretched 80 kilometers above the surface, which on Earth would equate to clouds extending all the way from the ground to the boundary of space. And those clouds were still capable of keeping the surface of Venus hidden in secrecy. But it was reasonable to conclude that there couldn't possibly be anything living down there. Based on this information, NASA mostly chose to forego additional exploration of Venus in the near future, viewing it as an environment entirely unfriendly for either humans or equipment. They shifted attention to the Moon and Mars. The Soviets were less persuaded. They believed they were on the verge of a monumental breakthrough. And with the U.S. withdrawing, it was theirs to claim. They redirected their endeavors to ready the second series of Venera probes. But they had no notion just how dire things were about to become. Artificial intelligence isn't merely altering the way we operate. It's transforming the way we reason. The same type of groundbreaking technology that carried us to orbit, charted the stars, and constructed rockets that land autonomously is now reshaping every domain on Earth. The query is, are you acquiring knowledge on how to utilize it? That's why I've collaborated with Outskill, who are organizing a complimentary 2-day Lev AI masterclass this weekend. It's a practical session where you'll gain knowledge directly from specialists at Microsoft, OpenAI, NVIDIA, and Google. Individuals who've assisted in establishing the basis of the AI age. In just 16 hours, you'll investigate over 10 AI instruments, learn how to construct AI-driven processes, and even develop your own AI assistants. Typically, this course costs almost $400, but currently, Outskill is providing free registrations for the first 1,000 individuals to enroll. And if you participate in both days, you'll access over $5,000 in special rewards. From a thorough prompt guide to a plan for profiting from AI and your own customized AI set. If you're intrigued by the technology forming our future, this is your opportunity to not just observe history develop, but to participate in it. So secure your spot now using the link in the description and enter the next major advance in human progress. AI. The year is 1966, and we are already examining a completely different space competition. The Americans have caught up, and placing people on the moon has become the primary goal for both countries. But that doesn't mean the Soviets have overlooked Venus. They've actually devoted these 4 years to constructing a larger and more robust spacecraft for Venera 3 and 4. It's now measuring over 900 kilograms, increased from about 650 on the prior version. These new probes are fitted with various devices, like a pressure gauge, a radar height meter, gas examiners, temperature sensors, and a removable pod that would act as an entry unit. The concept was that the entry unit would descend via parachute through the Venusian atmosphere and gather readings about the makeup, heat, and force all the way to the ground. In actuality, matters became somewhat complex. Venera 3 suffered another system malfunction en route, but the Soviets' trajectory was accurate, so the probe still succeeded in striking Venus like a projectile. This became the first artificial item to ever collide with another planet. The USSR actually achieved a triple on impacting nearby celestial bodies. They were the first to crash on the Moon, Venus, and Mars. There's likely a moral in there. If you're going to fail, do it memorably. Anyway, Venera 4 in 1967 was the nearest yet to a victory tale. The probe reached Venus with all functions operational and released the capsule into the Venusian atmosphere. From there, the entry unit activated its parachutes and floated gradually toward the surface. This was the first spacecraft to ever gather measurements within the atmosphere of another planet. Data sent back by the probe revealed something quite fascinating. At elevated heights, the atmosphere of Venus is very akin to Earth on a balmy summer day. a completely welcoming setting. But the deeper the probe descends, the more severe the conditions turn. Not only increasing in heat, but in air pressure too. Much like submerging deep into the sea, which is an odd idea to grasp, the air is not only dense, but it's truly heavy as well. It becomes so intense that after 90 minutes of gradual drop, communication from the probe ceases. It's generally thought that the capsule was simply squashed like a soda can by the mass of the planet's atmosphere. With this fresh knowledge, the Soviets were almost sure that their remaining Venera 5 and 6 probes of the identical design would have no opportunity of arriving at the surface unharmed. But they dispatched them regardless, with consecutive missions in January 1969. At this stage in the decade, the Americans had already sent a crew into orbit around the moon and were readying to take the initial steps on the lunar terrain. The Soviets realized they weren't going to match that. But perhaps if this Venus investigation succeeds, and they can uncover something remarkable on the surface, then they might still possess an accomplishment that maintains them competitive in the space competition. But triumph would not arrive simply. Both Venera probes captured less than an hour of data, each before encountering the same crushing outcome as their forerunner. And yet, the Soviet Union was not disheartened in their pursuits. They would merely construct even larger and even sturdier probes. But triumph would not arrive simply. Both Venera probes captured less than an hour of data, each before encountering the same crushing outcome as their forerunner. And yet, the Soviet Union was not disheartened in their pursuits. They would merely construct even larger and even sturdier probes. And they would attempt once more. For their subsequent round of Venera landing tries, numbers 7 and 8, the Soviets made 2 essential alterations to the probe structure. For one, the entry unit was now constructed with a denser outer casing of steel to withstand the air pressure. And 2, the interior of the probe was strengthened with an inner ball of titanium to shield devices from the warmth and extra cushioning around the ball to cushion the impact from collision, which was a wise decision because when Venera 7's parachute activated on August 17, 1970, it didn't endure very long. The fabric somehow tore, or it simply melted. Either way, the landing unit wound up falling like a stone, attaining a final speed of 61 kilometers per hour before rebounding off the Venusian surface. Based on that signal, the watchers back on Earth presumed that they were viewing yet another failure to arrive at the surface operational. But this was not the situation. Even with a damaged antenna, the lander was transmitting back details. And what Venera 7 uncovered would verify scientists' gravest concerns. The temperature noted at the surface indicated 475 C, or about 900 F, which is equivalent to the interior of a wood-fired pizza furnace, and much too hot for any device to function dependably. And yet the Soviets remained resolute. At this juncture, what did they have to forfeit? The Americans had already placed their flag on the moon. That competition was victorious. But the Soviets were still presented with other chances to leave their imprint on history. They could be the first to make revolutionary findings on Venus regarding the beginnings of life and the cosmos. They could even be the first to touch down on Mars. This is the path the Soviet Union would shift with their space initiative in the 1970s. Interplanetary discovery. In 1971, they sent a probe that would accomplish the first ever gentle landing on the surface of Mars. The lander only functioned for around 20 seconds before becoming entirely inactive. But it was still a significant achievement. Then, in 1972, they would revisit Venus once more with Venera 8. Astonishingly, this probe would not encounter any mechanical issues along the journey. The entry unit parachuted down gently onto the planet's surface with all of its tools undamaged and gathered data for almost 1 hour. So by now we understand that, in addition to the severe heat, the air pressure on the surface of Venus is equal to 92 times the atmosphere on Earth. which is identical to being 1 kilometer beneath the water. And if that wasn't sufficient, the lower atmosphere is saturated with sulfuric acid. That's the substance in a vehicle battery. Now, you would assume all of this verified information would finally discourage even the most dedicated technicians. But the Soviet Union just didn't accept quitting. Not when they were this near to solidifying their heritage as the first interplanetary discoverers. So, they directed their aims right back at Venus, because Venera 8 disclosed one final detail that was just too enticing to ignore. Even with the thick cloud blanket, there was still adequate sunlight arriving at the surface of Venus to capture a picture. And if triumphant, that could be the first ever image taken on another planet. For Venera 9, the Soviets implemented a basic modification to the probe's layout. And you can notice there's something unique just by observing it. The entry capsule itself has, naturally, been enhanced yet again. We are now exceeding the scales at nearly 5 metric tons, or approximately the mass of a mature African elephant. But the prominent characteristics relate to a fresh landing method. Considering everything that they now comprehend about Venus, the Soviets desire to minimize their probe's contact with the surroundings as much as feasible. And they also discovered that even after being released unintentionally and falling hundreds of meters, the 7 still succeeded in operating. So what occurs if we release the probe deliberately? And this is what's happening with those 2 circles. At the base is actually the landing equipment or collision ring, just a level metal disc linked to the primary structure by a sequence of shock dampener supports. And at the summit is the new aerobrake. It's how they arrive on Venus without a parachute needed. This item that resembles a strange cap is all you truly require to reduce the velocity of the probe sufficiently for a secure arrival. That is utilizing the remarkably dense atmosphere of Venus effectively, because it truly acts more like liquid than it does like any air you've ever encountered. But what about those imaging devices? Well, this is the initial picture ever captured of Venus. It was recorded on monochrome film by Venera 9 in 1975. What we are observing is an area of fractured, sharp stones encircled by a sand-resembling substance. It's not precisely awe-inspiring. The image is only captivating because it was captured on Venus, but still extremely impressive. And this is the scene from Venera 10, and matching lander that reached just a few days afterward. Now we are viewing level terrain with scarcely any of those pieces of stone, just the even surface of what was likely once an old lava stream. Venera 11 and 12 were less remarkable operations. They didn't transmit any intriguing pictures due to protective cover malfunctions. This was one of the challenges with Venus. You must safeguard the camera during the descent, or it will dissolve too soon. But then you have to depend on an automatic mechanism to uncover the lens. And it didn't always succeed. But then we arrive at Venera 13, an unfortunate numeral, but a very triumphant operation in the year 1981. This probe sent back the first ever colored image of the Venusian terrain. Again, the terrain around the lander is just flat sandy stone, but you can observe just a hint of scenery beyond. The probe landed close to the rim of a precipice, so you can gain a feeling of dimension that makes it all appear much more authentic and more otherworldly simultaneously. Anyway, you can also view the foundation of the lander again here, and you're likely pondering, what is the purpose of those spikes? They appear almost deliberately harsh, but the spikes performed an aerodynamic role. Metal blades were attached to the exterior of the collision ring in an attempt to prevent the probe from rotating and vibrating as it descended, which could result in difficult arrivals. But that's not all the Venera 13 could accomplish. The probe was also fitted with a boring tool and terrain sampler to evaluate the Venusian dirt. What it uncovered was a substance very akin to a rock that we term tuff on Earth. It's basically just hardened volcanic residue. Oh, and one additional item. Venera 13 included a sound recorder, so we can hear the noises of Venus. It's basically just breeze sounds and the noise of the probe performing its tasks. But again, like the images, there's something very odd and extraterrestrial about it. Venera 14 was again quite nearly matching. It discovered another level expanse of these even stones, which were found to be very comparable to tholeiitic basalt, which is a volcanic stone that composes most of the Earth's sea bottom. And that was it. That's the final occasion that an artificial item penetrated the surface of Venus, and along with it comes the ultimate picture ever captured of the surface. But what I want to focus on here is why we never returned. One very clear explanation would be that it's a great deal of effort and a great deal of cost for comparatively small return. You can dispatch a robot to Mars, and it'll endure for years. The longest a Venera lander ever lasted was about 2 hours. The Venera initiative concluded right as the Soviet Union itself was concluding. Guidance and focuses shifted. Russia experienced a difficult period in the 1990s. Meanwhile, NASA has just been too practical to attempt and arrive at the surface of Venus, attempting to rationalize that expense to lawmakers. When you receive so little in exchange, is not a debate researchers would readily succeed. So for now, the surface of Venus stays one of the solar system's greatest enigmas. So near yet so distant.